Looks like we are recording.
Oh, okay, we're already recording. Great. So welcome everybody to the WMOST training. Okay, great. So the schedule is in your printouts. I won't go over that to save us some time. But I will go over quickly some resources that we have online. And I'd also like to invite you all to please ask me questions throughout. So feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. And then we will also ask you some questions as we go along to learn more about how you might use WMOST and the issues you might be solving in your position. So the resources online, there's a WMOST webpage that you see there, and there we have theoretical documentation, including mathematical equations, all the details that you might want. There's a user guide that goes through most of what we'll go through today, plus additional details. And then we have quite a few case study examples. So as you see on the webpage, we have documents, and then we have the case study files. In addition, we have some additional case studies that are available on the Apt Associates website that have to do with case study applications for meeting Massachusetts Water Management Act requirements. And we'll talk more about that today as we'll use one of those case studies as our demonstration. For workshop materials, you got hard copy handouts of the presentation, some excerpt of the user guide, so that is something you can follow along with. We will be covering some of that material. You got a full page printout of the WMOST schematic, which we'll also go through in detail. And then on the CD, you have the following files that are listed that we just went through copying onto your computer, and we will use those. So I would like to start with a definition of integrated water resources management, because it's the inspiration behind WMOST, and it's also what WMOST is intended to help facilitate. The Global Water Partnership is the most often cited definition, so we'll use that one. And the definition starts as a process which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources. So it's a process, it's not an end point or somewhere you arrive. And it's also coordinated, so it involves multiple stakeholders, multiple agencies, or other entities. And then water, land, and related resources. This is quite an inclusive set of resources, but we'll talk about how to put a boundary around that in a couple of slides. And then it goes on to say that in this coordinated process of development, we want to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner. So it's talking about maximizing or optimizing the welfare or the outcome of our management, and it's talking about doing it in an equitable or balanced way. And we will talk more about the concept of maximizing or optimizing because it is a unique feature of WMOST. And it does include the sustainability requirement, so without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. So we have economic and social welfare, and we have environmental considerations. And this is important because the ecosystems are the underlying systems in which we operate and do all of these other things. And they provide numerous free ecosystem services, for example, wetlands filter water, as a very basic example. So it's a process which promotes coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. So that's quite a few pieces to keep in mind. So this definition, there are quite a few other organizations that advocate for integrated water resources management and that have tailored their own definition based on their own missions. And in addition to these few, so everything we cite on these slides are fully referenced and cited in the last few slides so that you can look them up and follow up on anything that we talk about and cite. So there are quite a few organizations, as you can see, that support integrated management, and this is just a small handful. But there are quite a few requirements. So there's a lot of support, so there must be something good about it, but there's a lot of requirements. So I would be tempted to say, well, you know, why bother trying to do all of this at once, coordinating with people, considering so many things? And then even if I do bother, how would I go about managing something like this? So let's see if we can answer these two questions. So the first one is, why bother with integrated management? So it talks about meeting multiple needs and goals, and some of those might be conflicting, some synergistic. So withdrawals would be conflicting with in-stream uses. But it explicitly wants to encompass everyone within the management scheme. And this is one place where I wanted to pause and ask if you all would be willing to share a few examples in your position, in your experience. What are the different needs that you're tasked with meeting, whether it's conflicting or synergistic, some of the stakeholders, some of the needs? Who would be willing to give a few examples? Yes, please.
I worked on a project in the Rocky Mountains where we were trying to address consulting with community members, fishermen, homeowners. I guess that would be my.
Great. So I heard conflicting needs of not wanting flooding in your backyard, but then creating flooding downstream. So that's we'll have talk more about that, thinking about the whole system, and then people using downstream for fishing and other resource needs. Yes, please.
So another example is, I'm from Maine, and we get our drinking water from the Sebago Lake. It's one of the cleanest water sources in the country, and it's all about uses and development pressure on a natural.
Thank you for that example, and I'm going to briefly repeat it so the recording gets it as well, which is there's development around the lake, which is also a water source, and with more development, there is more pollution, I'm assuming, so that you're saying that there would have to be a water filtration plant installed. So the question is, do you preserve the natural infrastructure so you can avoid the filtration, or do you allow development? How, and it seems to be pitted against each other, but is there sort of way forward for everybody's needs? So there's people desiring to live there and develop, and there is a desire not to spend a lot of money on a filtration plant, but still have clean water. Great. Anyone else? Thank you for those examples. We'll share more as we go out throughout the day, but this is all very interesting and helpful for us. Thank you. So it explicitly says we're going to manage multiple needs, whether it's different stakeholders or whether it's downstream, upstream issues. And it also promotes efficient use of resources. So it talked about maximizing outcomes. So one example I have here is from UNH study that's very recent. And it's about assessing the cost for nitrogen reductions in Great Bay Estuary in New Hampshire. And the study evaluated two options for 3 towns. There are 3 towns in the lower sub-basin, and that's the map that you see here that's delineated. And these 3 towns had their nitrogen reduction allocation. And they also have wastewater and stormwater permits. So the first option looked at each town meeting their own reduction and each permit meeting their own reduction and permit. So everybody minding their own business. The second option looked at integrating across the towns and across the permits. So meeting a total reduction across all entities. And what they found was that cooperation would save approximately $100 million across the 3 towns. Now, as you can see in the second graph, these are, in yellow, you see the costs for meeting the reductions for each town if they were not cooperating. And in yellow, you see the integrated cooperation, and in green, you see the individual permitting. And you can see that the costs reductions are not evenly distributed, but if you're going to save 100 million across 3 towns, it would certainly be quite a bit of motivation to create a memorandum of understanding or other agreements needed to facilitate it. And we've seen similar studies and similar results in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where there's actual trading that occurs between wastewater treatment plants and farmers, so meeting wastewater treatment plant permits using reductions implemented by farmers. And the EPA has issued policy guidance on such trading and permits. And there you see the original trading policy citation, but since then there's also been a toolkit developed for permit developers that's available online. So these are two benefits we would get out of integrated management. Now let's look at the two carrots, and now we can look at a stick, which is what happens when we don't practice integrated management. So as we've already heard, it could lead to preventing flooding in your own backyard, but creating flooding for someone else. But it can also lead to T-stream beds, so zero flow events. This is a nearby example in Ipswich, Massachusetts, where in the middle of the watershed there are low flow and zero flow events. And if you look carefully in the foreground there, those little white spots are dead fish, and that is the stream channel bed. So it's pretty dramatic. And then we also have Monpont in Halifax, Massachusetts, where water supply diversions reduced flows, natural flow, which flows east to west so much that the retention time has greatly increased in the pond. The nitrogen flushing that normally happens isn't there, or I'm sorry, it's phosphorus in this case. The phosphorus flushing isn't happening that's normally there, and it's resulting in blue-green algal blooms and beach closures. And you can see again, the visual effect is quite stunning. So I'll throw this example out. So you've already mentioned flooding downstream. Are there other examples you've seen of unintended consequences when solving one problem and then something else happens that was unintended consequence? Anyone have one of those examples? Not yet? Okay. Well, maybe we'll come across somewhere. But these are two very local examples, one that's more quantity related and one that's more quality related. But as we're aware, the two are quite connected. Great. So if we have these benefits and these motivations, then how do we actually go about practicing this, especially given all the requirements that initial definition laid out for us? So EPA and other organizations advocate for a watershed approach as the best unit of management. And this has been around for a while in the European Union since 2000 when they passed the Water Framework Directive. It requires across countries to cooperate and develop watershed management plans. So for example, the River has a watershed management plan, but involves many countries, not many towns or many states. So let's quickly review a watershed. So a watershed is the land that water flows across or through on its way to a common stream, river, or lake. So any drop of water that falls within the watershed will end up in the same place. It makes a very nice logical and natural unit of management. So let's take a look. If this is going to be our unit of management for integrated management, let's take a look and see what it is we need to include when we're considering it. So we have the natural hydrologic cycle, which, as the initial polling showed, most of us are familiar with. So we have the precipitation, then we have the land responding to that precipitation as either evapotranspiration, so evaporation from water bodies, or transpiration from vegetation. And then we have runoff, or we have infiltration into the aquifer, which comes out as base flow into our surface waters. So those are the four major flows. And as we'll see in WMOST, we take data that covers the land, modeling the land response to precipitation, and we start out with data that's the runoff and the recharge. But we'll cover that more in detail. So we have the basic natural hydrologic cycle. Then we have the human engineering systems, which includes withdrawals, reservoirs, groundwater withdrawals, well fields. We also have discharges, whether it's industrial or municipal wastewater. And we also have land development, whether that's ultra-urban or whether it's farming. Either way, it's changing the land's response Oh,
Forget to
thank
drink
you.
water.
Thank you, thank you. It changes the land's response to precipitation, both in terms of quantity and quality, timing. So we need to account for that when we're considering the management of our system. Okay, what else? So we have two systems, natural and the human engineered system. Then we also have passive users and other stakeholders that may not be directly affecting the use, but are interested in the use. So we need to consider all the stakeholders, and we need to consider how much everything costs. So if we're going to have goals for the different stakeholders, we want to know what it takes to get there and how much does that cost if we're going to make cost-effective decisions, which I think is a winning point for every stakeholder. And then legal requirements. So what is actually technically and legally feasible? For example, direct portable reuse of wastewater is not commonly practiced in the US, so that may be something that is not included. So we would like a tool that helps us consider all of these pieces at once, meeting the multiple needs, preventing unintended consequences, and doing it cost effectively. So this is what we designed and intended WMOST for. So let's see if it holds up to its name. We're going to review all the pieces of WMOST, which means all the components that are in the model, and then all the flows that are associated with those components. Which of those you will have in your model will depend on your study area and the data that you put into the model. So you'll end up customizing these pieces, and you may or may not have every piece. So you can reference on your own schematic the different pieces, and we'll go bit by bit. We'll start with the yellow shapes. These are external inflows or outflows from our water accounting system. So you can think of WMOST as a really big water balance. It adds, subtracts, flows, and keeps track for you. So we start off with the yellow shape. In the middle here, you see land use areas, runoff, and recharge rates. So we specify the land use that is in our system. You see here, it's described as baseline HRUs. So if somebody had experience with HRUs, can tell us what those are, or hydrologic response units. I don't see anybody popping at it.
Brian, you must know.
But that's no problem. I don't want to put anybody too much on the spot, but we've already talked about the precipitation's response to the land surface. So hydrologic response unit is how the land hydrologically responds to precipitation, and areas that are similar in response, so we'll have a similar proportion of runoff versus recharge, can be called the same hydrologic response unit. So for example, we might split up our watershed into different land uses because a developed land use will respond differently than a non-developed land use. So we'll delineate those areas, and you can delineate those depending on how refined you want to make it. It might be land use intersected with soil. So I want to have developed land use on soil A and soil B, C, and D, which are different infiltration categories. So you might want to intersect with that. Some people also add slope onto it. So it might be land use, soil, and slope consideration. So once you've defined your areas, you specify them here. And we'll cover this in more detail. And the automated features in WMOST will simplify this for you because it will provide different types of land uses for you to consider. So we start with land uses that are in your study area, and we will also enter runoff and recharge rates associated with them. And as we saw, the land responds and sends runoff to surface water, and it sends recharge to the groundwater. So two flows come out of it. And we can consider stormwater managed areas. If we put a stormwater management, let's say a detention pond, a retention pond, infiltration trench, whatever it is, it'll change the response of the surface. So it'll have different runoff and recharge. So we would specify those runoff and recharge rates, and that would send runoff and recharge. So basically two flows come out of land areas. The flow then goes from the groundwater as base flow, goes to the surface water. A lot of models, including WMOST, we model the aquifer as a linear system, which simply means that we take the volume, we multiply it by a fraction, and that volume comes out into the stream flow. And that fraction is called the groundwater recession coefficient. And we'll come back to this term again. So the groundwater recession coefficient determines how much of the groundwater flows to the surface water. So now we're added the surface water, which then, if you have it, you can specify a reservoir. And the reservoir is conceptualized at the outlet of the watershed or the bottom of the watershed. That's why you see another surface outflow here, where it goes to external surface water outflow. So anything that's external is outside of our accounting system. And the reservoir or lake, some kind of surface storage, is at the bottom of the study area. Okay, so we covered land area resulting in runoff and recharge, and then the surface water going to the reservoir. And that's our basic hydrologic system, our natural system in WMOST. We see two other boxes at the top left and bottom left. And these are external surface water and groundwater. So if your study area has upstream areas, then you might have surface water coming in. And then you also have private surface water and groundwater. So this is non-municipal withdrawals and discharges. For example, an agricultural irrigation well would not be on municipal water. So you'll see that a lot of this model is built from the municipality's perspective. So these are our basic flows. It gets easier from here. So that's our source water. Then we have treated water. And treated water, we have two options. We either withdraw from surface water or groundwater and go to a potable water treatment plant. And potable, just to cover that, means drinkable, meaning this is going to produce drinking water quality. This treatment system will produce drinking water quality water. And you can have interbasin transfer of potable water. So for example, in Massachusetts is the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. Thank you. Agency Association Authority. There we go. MWRA, as we commonly call it. So we have two sources where we could get water from in our system. If we are hooked up to MWRA, we can specify this, or if we want to consider hooking up to MWRA, we can specify a cost, and the model may choose to pull water from there. We also cover leakage from a distribution system, and that is something that we can also potentially manage. And then from the potable water treatment system, we get potable uses and non-potable uses. So potable use is what you drink and cook with. Non-potable use is what you might use outside for lawn watering. That's becoming more common in places like California, Arizona, and Florida. And in some places, it's also used for toilet flushing and other non-contact inside uses. But the majority of non-potable use we think of as outdoor irrigation. Some portion of that exits our system, so it's consumptive use. It's what we drink or it's what evaporates from our lawn. And it's accounted for here and it exits our system. It's the yellow box. So that's our water use. Then we have wastewater. We have three options for wastewater. Again, interbasin transfer, exported and someone else deals with it and it leaves the system. We have a wastewater treatment plant, or we have septic systems. For the wastewater treatment plant, you also see that we have groundwater infiltration there. So that is also accounted for, so you can specify how much of your wastewater is actually clean groundwater infiltrating in, and you can then potentially invest in managing that. And then for septic systems, we have two options. If you're a town, you might have some of your septic systems within the modeled area or some outside. So you want to be able to specify how much of the septic systems actually recharge the study area you're modeling and how much recharges outside of the basin. So we've made accommodations for that. And then finally, water reuse, which is not very common yet or in the Northeast, but do exist elsewhere and may be considered in some situations as cost effective, and so we allow for it in the model for you to consider it. One is a water reuse facility. This could be a standalone facility that treats wastewater and then is reused as non-potable water. So you see an arrow going back to non-potable. It can also discharge to surface water, sort of a scenario left in case if you're in a really dire condition and you're going to treat the water and release cleaner water back into the river, that possibility is there. And then there's aquifer storage and recharge. So clean it to a standard where the state or other regulations would allow you to then recharge it, and it ends up being what's called indirect reuse. It goes back into the groundwater system from which you can then reuse for water supply. So these are all the components and all the flows. And this represents one subbasin. So whatever subbasin or study area or modeling, it'll represent that. And we'll talk more about these land uses in one moment. And the one thing I wanted to come back to is that the reservoir is thought of as being at the outlet of the watershed. So all of the land area drains to one stream reach, drains to one groundwater aquifer component and one reservoir. And this is called a spatially lumped model, and that is what we'll get more into under baseline hydrology. Okay, so these are the components. Now, what can we do with them? So let's cover the management actions. We can conserve undeveloped land use. So if you're looking at a future scenario and you're looking at what built-out land use might look like, you would want to consider, would it be cost-effective from a water supply perspective to buy some forest or other undeveloped land and conserve it from development? We can also look at stormwater management. What type of stormwater management depends on the input data you provide. So it could be traditional, it could be green infrastructure, it could be low impact development. The surface water, you can optimize reservoir operations. So in terms of reservoir releases, and you can also optimize operations at the water treatment plant facility, meaning how much groundwater versus surface water do I take and with what timing. You can also increase the capacity. So if you're looking at future scenarios, every existing facility you can specify an incremental increase in its capacity. As I mentioned before, you can repair unaccounted for water, which may be leakage from your distribution system. We've already discussed a non-potable reuse as an option. We have two demand management options that can represent, there's a wide range of management options out there, but we have two, one that's a price signal and one that's specific amount of volume reduction for a specific cost that can represent a wide range of management practices that are out there, rebates, education. You can reduce infiltration inflow, we had mentioned that, and increasing capacity if you have a wastewater treatment plant, or you could consider going from septic to sewering and building a wastewater treatment plant. You can build additional treatment, and I will mention that in all of these, you can, depending on the cost you specify, it could be building a new facility or it could be an add-on. It depends on the cost you specify. So for the water reuse facility, I can specify an add-on cost for the wastewater treatment plant, or I can specify a cost that's building a brand new plant from scratch. So what the model represents will depend on the data you provide it. And then aquifer storage and recharge we talked about. This is when you inject water into the groundwater system. It can be indirect reuse. You can do flood skimming, which is taking high flows in the spring when you have more than enough water and using your underwater reservoir or underground reservoir, your groundwater system for storage. And then finally, we have the interbasin transfer, which you can optimize its use or in some cases just determine if it's cost effective to initiate. Okay, so these are the components, the flows, and the management actions. So we've basically covered the model, and we will shortly also cover the model by going through the model, but this is the conceptual overview, and we'll go through each piece again. That is one of the things you'll see. We'll repeat everything a couple of times, and then hopefully leads to more familiarity when you come back to it. So this tool has specific objectives, which I wanted to go over so that it's important to know what it was built for, because that would be its most appropriate use. And then, of course, it can be extrapolated based on your knowledge and experience to other appropriate uses. But it's meant to support integrated management at the municipality or sub-basin scale. So as I mentioned, and we'll discuss again, it's a spatially lumped model, so it's appropriate at the municipality or sub-basin. It wouldn't necessarily be appropriate at something like the Chesapeake Bay watershed scale. And its intention is to screen cost-effective actions to meet goals. So we specify the goals, and it tells us what are cost-effective actions, but it's a screening tool. So that's not going to give you a detailed prescription of exactly how many acres of stormwater BMPs or exactly how many dollars or cents to invest in demand management. It's going to rank your management actions on a cost-effective basis. And it will also tell you where to invest more money in terms of, as the most cost-effective action, let me do a feasibility study and confirm those costs that I initially estimated. It can provide insights on trade-offs between different goals you have, or trade-offs between investing additional money for getting more of your goal, for example, for achieving higher minimum stream flows. And by all this, we hope that we enhance the understanding of the watershed for those involved. So the overall goal question that WMOST answers is, what are the least cost combination of actions to achieve water quantity management goals? That pretty much sums up the model and what it's going to help you do. And water quantity is what version 2 answers right now. Version 3, which will be out later this year, early next year, will address also water quality. So what are some of the goals? I'll give you a few examples, and we'll come up with more as we go along. You can just see what's most cost-effective way to meet your 20-year projected demand if you're the municipality. You might also have targets for minimum in-stream flows, or you might have flooding issues and want to specify maximum peak flows. And you may want to estimate the value of land conservation for water supply, and we'll cover each of these in more detail. So these are some of the examples of goals you can set, quantitative goals you can set in WMOST. So that is an important piece to mention, is that you want to consider all the stakeholders in the watershed and translate as many of the goals and needs into quantitative targets as you can. So one piece is, so when we talk about the least cost combination of actions, we come back to this idea of optimization or maximizing use. So I want to cover briefly the difference between simulation and optimization models, and the easiest way to do that is to give you a brief example. So let's say our management goal is to prevent groundwater depletion. We're going to set the minimum groundwater volume that we're willing to go. We know there's a minimum threshold that it should not surpass each year or at any point in the year. So we set a minimum groundwater volume, and we take a simulation model where we specify one value for each decision or each potential action we want to take. In an optimization model, as we'll see, we'll specify a range of decisions. So I might look at scenario 1. Repair infiltration to wastewater pipes. I run it. It's not quite enough. I'm still depleting my groundwater below that threshold. So I add in reducing withdrawals with a 10% price increase. And I see that it's still not quite enough. So I run it again, scenario 3, and now I'm going to infiltrate some stormwater, and I see that, well, it's actually more than I needed. So let me try this other combination of two things. Let me try to reduce withdrawals and infiltrate stormwater. And now I see that, well, that's almost enough, but let me try the other combination. And then I see now I'm getting there, but I'm not quite sure if that's most cost effective yet. So I'm going to run the other all three options that were too much, but not run them all at maximum. So I'm going to reduce withdrawals with only a 5% increase, not a 10% increase. I'm going to repair only 80% of infiltration into wastewater. I'm not going to hunt for those other 15%. And I'm going to infiltrate stormwater on only 15 acres of land use. Maybe that's more cost effective than maximizing and using all of the other two options, of only two options. So I run that and I look at my costs. But then, as you can see pretty quickly, you come up with not just which of the options I want to use, but how much of each. So when you have numerous options, you get pretty close to a nearly endless combination of runs. So compare that with an optimization model where we specify ranges. So our scenario says that we're willing to reduce withdrawals with a price increase of up to 20%. So that value could be anywhere from 0 to 20. Infiltration to wastewater pipes, anywhere from 0 to 95%, because 95% is probably the practical maximum we can repair. And so we need to tell the model that rather than specify 0 to 100. Then we want to say that stormwater, we could infiltrate anywhere from 0 to 2 inches. And we have 25 acres of commercial land use available. And I'm going to further specify that some is on sand and gravel and some is on till, because it will be more expensive on till, which infiltrates slower. And I'm going to evaluate difference between an infiltration basin and bioretention basin to see how they compare. So now I'm specifying even more options, but I specify all of those, and then the optimization solver determines which combinations and how much of each will get me the least cost. So that's the difference between simulation and optimization. It's quite powerful in terms of manpower savings and simplifying your modeling. So let's look at optimization specifically for WMOST. And the pieces of an optimization model, because you'll hear us use these terms throughout. So we have decisions. These are the model chooses the value of these variables. In WMOST, these are the actions. Which actions and how much of each. And then we're going to specify constraints. So there are physical laws that we want to specify, because the model only knows what we tell it. So there are already a lot of physical laws pre-programmed, like whatever flows in and flows out has to balance in the stream reach. And in the reservoir, whatever flows in and flows out will be the difference in the volume. So those basic things are programmed for you, but you'll specify your own limits, for example, minimum, maximum groundwater volume, and then your management goals, which might be the minimum stream flow you want to achieve and the minimum demand you have in your town. And then we're going to have an objective that we either minimize or maximize. In WMOST, we minimize, and we minimize the cost. So minimize the annualized capital and operation costs, annual capital and operation maintenance costs for all management actions. So depending on your time period of interest, which you specify, your planning horizon, it'll annualize all your capital investment, and it will consider all the annual costs that go on over those 20 years of planning period. So decisions, constraints, objectives. And in WMOST, we always have the same objective, and it's the constraints and the goals that the user specifies and change. And then the model comes and tells you which decisions are appropriate for those specific goals that you specify. So what WMOST ends up doing based on the data you put in is it builds you a custom optimization model. And we've seen in some of our case studies that we've modeled for a 5-year period at a daily time step. It writes over 70,000 equations and it performs 42,000 iterations. So remember when I told you about the scenarios, it'll run 42,000 scenarios for you. And within about 6 minutes, or as long as it takes to get a cup of coffee, it'll tell you the decision of approximately 70,000 decision variables. Now that's a lot. You're saying we're not making that many management action decisions, but it considers the flows and all the components at every time step. So if you take 5 years times 365, now you have, you see where the 70,000 comes from. So these types of problems require an optimization solver, which is a mathematically different concept from simulation. And it's simply an algorithm that determines the values for the variables given a set of equations or inequalities. And one example is the Excel solver. So how many people have used Excel solver or something similar? Great. So that gives you an idea of WMOST. The Excel solver doesn't handle the number of variables we deal with. So we link with a different solver, but you don't have to worry about it because it's behind the scenes. And we're showing you a lot here, but we're going to get to the demonstration moment and show you that when you're actually using the model, not all these details are necessary for implementing and applying the model. So as a review before we get to the working with the model and the demonstration. It's compatible Excel 2010 and 2013. It uses Visual Basic applications in the background to help you set up input tables and pull in data that we supply for you. And as I said, it's linked with other software that's invisible to you. One is LP Solve, which was included with your CD. And then the other is the Stormwater module, which is EPA's Sustain model. So WMOST links with it, runs it for you, and pulls data back into the model. And we'll also demonstrate that. That's not installed on your computer, so that's the one part of the demonstration you won't be able to do, but you'll see it on my computer. So the scope of the model, I already told you, has water balance, so water accounting. It's a big mass balance calculator, basically. But it also has cost accounting for the cost effectiveness piece. So it has two accounting systems going on. We input watershed characteristics, the effective management actions, and the cost of management actions. And as I mentioned, its spatial resolution is lumped. You can have a variable number of land uses or hydrologic response units, but then all the runoff from the land goes to one specific stream reach, and all the recharge goes to one groundwater bucket. The temporal resolution, you may run it daily or monthly, and the length of the modeling period is defined by you. We provide you data